Michael Gove has admitted mistakes and errors were made by politicians during the COVID pandemic as he issued an apology to victims and families while giving evidence at the inquiry today.
I want to take this opportunity, if I may, my lady, to apologise to the victims who endured so much pain, the families who endured so much loss as a result of the mistakes that were made by government in response to the pandemic. And as a minister responsible for the Cabinet Office and who was also close to many of the decisions that were made, I must take my share of responsibility for that.
Mr Gove worked in the Cabinet Office during the first 18 months of the pandemic, which is responsible for the smooth running of government. But he's criticised the state of the department, likening it to a Mary Poppins bag.
There was a tendency, there has been a tendency, amongst successive prime ministers to shove into the Cabinet Office responsibilities that do not appear to fit conveniently or easily elsewhere. At different times, different prime ministers have used the Cabinet Office, for example, to lead on drugs policy or on policy towards charities and the third sector. So it becomes a sort of Mary Poppins bag into which different prime ministers will shove things that they believe require to be dealt with by the government's nanny.
Gosh, joining me in the studio now, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times, Aubrey Allegretti. Thanks, Aubrey. And we're also joined by NHS GP Dr Lawrence Buckman. I don't know if they're both aficionados of Mary Poppins. I've read it. I love the film. It's a strangely kind of infantile analogy, isn't it? And also, Mary Poppins doesn't shove things into her bag. She takes things out of her bag. However, the kind of... I mean, you might say it's a kind of Mickey Mouse upsum of what was going on in that department. Let's start with you, Aubrey, for the political side of things. Did you know, had you thought, is it widely known that the cabinet over which Michael Gove presided in COVID was kind of a raggle-taggle bunch of things that weren't really supposed to be attended to by that department?
Well, the Cabinet Office has always been this sort of hodgepodge, really. It's supposed to be the glue that hold the rest of the parts of government together. And so Michael Gove was elucidating on some of those issues, the kind of odd bits of policy that had been picked up, almost sort of the scrap heap, really, of what all the other departments didn't want. And so there was a real sort of distraction of focus, if you like, in the Cabinet Office at the start of the pandemic. But he is also somebody who is one of the more cerebral cabinet ministers. And I think it was really interesting that he was so candid and upfront with his apology at the start of his evidence today.
What was he implying that the Cabinet Office ought to have been doing? Or what should his role have been, did he say, or did he think?
Well, I sort of got the impression that Michael Gove was saying that the Cabinet Office should have taken a sort of more front and centre role. He talked, for example, about Matt Hancock chairing Cobra meetings. They are codenamed after the Cabinet Office briefing room A. They are supposed to be held by the Cabinet Office. And he said that Matt Hancock, when he was Health Secretary, was effectively marking his own homework, because what you should have is somebody, the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister, somebody in the Cabinet Office, chairing those meetings and asking Minister A, what have you done about this? Asking Minister B, have you done what you said you would do?
Yeah.
And because Matt Hancock was doing it, who was the Health Secretary, he was the one person who wasn't actually being scrutinised in those meetings.
That's fascinating, because it sounds as if Michael Gove is saying that the Cabinet Office over which he presided was excluded from proceedings, that he wasn't kind of factored in because Matt Hancock in the Health Department was taking over matters. And that's a little bit like, isn't it, what Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, said yesterday, which was he was excluded, he wasn't part of it, he didn't know what to do because he was being left out of the key information and kind of having his power base eroded. It sounds a little similar, doesn't it?
Yes, and during COVID, there became this sort of dichotomy where the cabinet was divided into what were known as doves and hawks, so those who were pro and anti-lockdown. I mean, a pretty sort of crude binary division, but that was how it was seen. And Michael Gove was viewed as one of those who was thought to favour lockdowns more, who thought they were more important. We heard that testimony from him today, but he thought that he wasn't being listened to fully. And in fact, he spoke during his evidence about writing an email personally to Boris Johnson, advocating for them to go stronger in pushing for the third lockdown in January 2021. Why did he do that, he was asked? Well, because he wanted to make sure that the message wasn't interfered with, that he could get through to the Prime Minister directly for him to know his unvarnished thoughts. That suggests that he didn't think that going through the official channels was going to make much difference.
Tell us about hunting.
Yes, there was a rather sort of bizarre exchange. So obviously during the course of this inquiry, we've seen various different WhatsApp groups, and we saw a specific one today that was created with the purpose of trying to figure out how there could be an exemption for people to gather in groups for the purposes of hunting. Now, this harks back to something we heard from another senior Cabinet Office figure, Helen McNamara, who said that the government was almost obsessed more with male-dominated pursuits, and I think she even referenced something like hunting, than it was with, for example, supporting women who were having to give birth alone in hospital or domestic abuse victims. So we saw in the WhatsApp messages today that there was this effort to create an exemption for hunting, that there was also concern about the presentation of that. They didn't want it to be made very obvious or clear that they had inserted this exemption. And then another minister at the time, Nigel Adams, suggested that there had been a sort of successful lobbying campaign to get this change. So all of that, I think, suggesting that there were people who had better lines into government to get policies changed for their benefit than there were for others.
Gosh, I mean, I think many people listening will feel this absolutely beggars belief. Let me bring Dr Buckman into this. I mean, you're not here to be political. You're here because you're a doctor, but you're also human, and man is a political animal. And I just don't know what you think when you hear about exemptions for hunting being pushed through. And as Aubrey says, you know, and Helen McNamara said, you know, women who had to give birth all alone without partners or anybody with them to cheer them on or held their hands. And, you know, lots of them, and I actually used to phone my show at Radio London and BBC and, you know, say how unbelievably traumatised they were and how lonely and frightening it was just by themselves, soldiering through sometimes a 24-hour or more labour. I just wonder what your response is to all of this. It is quite astounding in a way.
No, sadly, it's completely believable. As someone who used to be involved in medical politics, remember I was the chairman of the BMA GPs committee just before COVID began. I used to meet all of these people, and Sir Humphrey is real, and in the loop and in the thick of it are, in fact, documentaries. So I'm not remotely surprised that they were lobbying over hunting and all sorts of other things when they messed up PPE and they messed up all sorts of other things. And the final spectacle, of course, was seeing our Queen, our late Queen, all alone at her husband's funeral while the Prime Minister and his mates were partying in Downing Street. And I believe anything that anyone said about the way games were played behind the scenes.
And when Dr Buckman says games were played, we did hear this. I mean, I think people will agree, they might not, but it seemed to me sincere apology from Michael Gove, who didn't have to apologise. No one asked him, do you feel like apologising? But he said, I'm very, very sorry, and I'm sorry for all the loss, and I'm sorry for the pain. He did say that. So does it sound to you as though he thought it was a game?
Well, I think there did seem to be genuine contrition there in a way that, I mean, he is still a government minister. He is still the cabinet minister responsible for levelling up. So he, if you like, still has sort of skin in the game. He's a politician who is still accountable. He's a member of parliament who has voters. So there is probably a reason why he feels like he needs to apologise as somebody that's still an active politician. But I think there is a fear that not enough sort of lessons were learned quickly enough at the time, that there shouldn't need to be an inquiry sort of years on. There were 3 lockdowns that happened and 3 opportunities, if you like, for the government to learn from the time before. And each time it seems like they didn't manage to learn the right lessons. So an apology, I'm sure, will be appreciated by the bereaved families, but it won't bring their relatives back.
No, and who else are we thinking we're going to be hearing from at the COVID inquiry for the rest of this week?
So we should hear from some of the other chief scientists at the time, including Jenny Harries, who was obviously criticised, particularly towards the start of the pandemic, for some of the sort of messaging that she came out with. So we're going to hear the rest of this week from others who might be able to shed a little bit more light on the sort of science behind it. Michael Gove, one of the main politicians, but we'll hear more from the scientists later this week.
And I just want to check with Dr Buckman. Dr Buckman, you think that there is a point to this, that this inquiry will bring, you know, this awful phrase, lessons will be learned. You never know if they really are or if they're immediately forgotten. Will it at least bring some kind of acknowledgement and closure to those people who lost beloved relatives to COVID? Or do you think it's just an expensive posturing and waste of our time?
I think it's very important, partly to see the people who took responsibility or who are responsible but didn't take responsibility, in other words, not Michael Gove, but others, actually be faced with the enormity of what they did and what they've done. And I think they need to be. And I think the dead and their relatives need to hear that. And they need the contrition, real contrition. I think Michael Gove was contrite today. I think that was genuine. I think they need to do this. Lessons are never learned. The idea that somebody will learn lessons, I think, is a fabrication. People do not learn lessons, but we will all remember this for the rest of our lives. This was our Second World War, if you like. And I think that the dead and the relatives need to hear this.
Thank you both very much indeed. Coming up after the break.